Tonight's story is dedicated to all those who fought in wars for any nation in this whole world. They've given up their lives to protect their families and liberties. And this book is actually a story written about one such night during World War I. It's taken from accounts from newspapers and letters sent home from soldiers who fought in the war. It's called The Christmas Truce. The 1900s, the final century of the recent millennium, brought unprecedented possibilities and promise. The children of these hundreds of years would see more improvement in the human condition of life than any other time in the world's history. Advances in medicine, science, and industry would all but eradicate disease, extend human life, and open a dialogue among the people of the earth and lift them into the vast reaches of space. But these hardly seem like possibilities during the Christmas of 1914. The nations of Europe were at war. Anxious to expand and defend their borders, they summoned their best and brightest to the battlefield. The young men answered by the millions. A 19-year-old German boy left his job in London to enlist in the German army. English boys working and studying in Hamburg and Paris returned to their homes in London, put on uniforms, and went back to fire among their former friends. Secretary of War Lord Kitchener expanded the British Army overnight by allowing schoolmates to enlist together. The tragedy of these battalions was no more evident than at Somme, France. Hundreds of villages on both sides lost almost all their young men in a single battle. Their little paybook that every British soldier carried included his last will and statement. Thousands of these booklets were collected from the bodies of young boys, many simply reading, "I leave all of my belongings to my mother." With hardly a backward glance, the promise of youth was poured into the blind and futile aggression known as the Great World War I. The new century brought all kinds of new warfare. Field commanders quickly realized that digging in was the only way to survive the sweep of machine gun. The German army had marched across Belgium before being stopped at Flanders Field. Some 60 yards away, British, French, and Belgian troops languished infested with mice, rats, and lice, pelted with freezing rain and tons of shrapnel. As temperatures dropped, disease took hold. Snipers picked off any who would raise their head above the earthen walls. The war was but 4 months old, and already each side was losing thousands of soldiers each day to bullets and the silent common enemy, influenza. Between the opposing trenches was an area about the width of a football field called No Man's Land. Littered with barbed wire and frozen corpses, it was a sobering reminder that what the field might bring. Soldiers who survived later recalled that their dead brothers were gathered up and stacked like cords of wood. By war's end, over 10 million lives were lost. Not surprisingly, given the circumstances, most of the soldiers were also religious. Many were Christian. On Sundays, communion was passed in trenches on both sides, often to the sound of churches in nearby villages. The occasional hymn was sung, and youthful voices were heard across enemy lines. By December, the war slowed and hopes for a quick resolution faded away. As the soldiers contemplated their desperate situation, nights grew long and hearts yearned to be home. December 23rd, a group of German soldiers quietly moved to the ruins of a bombed-out monastery. There, they held their own Christmas service. Later on that night, a few Christmas trees, or Tannenbaums, as they were called, began to appear along the German fortifications. their tiny candles flickering in the night. Across the way, British soldiers took an interest in those lights, and they sang together the carols of their youth. Word spread, and heads peeked cautiously over sandbags at the now thousands of Tannenbaums glowing like Christmas trees. Two British officers ventured over to the German line and, against orders, arranged a Christmas truce. But the negotiation was a mere formality by then. Up and down the trenches, men from both sides already had begun crossing the line to join the celebration. Lieutenant Sir Edward Holmes assaulted the enemy with music. In a letter to his mother he said, "We're going to give the enemy every conceivable song, from the carols of Tipperary." The Germans responded with a Christmas concert of their own. It was not long before the cold air rang out with everything from "Good King Wenceslas" to "Auld Lang Syne." For the next 2 days, those tidings continued to spring from the heart of common men who shared the common bond of Christmas. Further down the line, a German violinist stood atop his parapet, framed against the skeletons of bare trees and shattered fortifications, delicately perched on top of the desolate landscape, and his cold fingers conveyed the poignant beauty of Handel's Largo on his violin. Whatever the spirit of Christmas had been before that hour, it was now, above all, a spirit of hope and a spirit of peace. A British war correspondent reported that later the soldiers heard a clear voice singing the beloved French carol, "O Holy Night." The singer, Victor Grenier of the Paris Opera. The night watch must have lifted their eyes towards the heaven as they heard the plaintive call. Christmas Day dawned over the muddy fields, and both sides cautiously picked their way through the barbed wire. Side by side, they buried their dead. A German officer known only as Thomas gave Lieutenant Holmes a Christmas gift, a Victoria Cross, and a letter which belonged to an English captain. Lieutenant Holmes responded by giving a German officer his silk scarf. One German received a photograph of himself in uniform and asked his former enemies to post it to his sister in Liverpool. Men who had shot at each other only days before gathered in a sacred service for their fallen brothers. Prayers were offered, and the 23rd Psalm was read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of forgiveness, of righteousness, for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff shall comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." 19-year-old Arthur Pelham Byrne, who hoped to study at the ministry after the war ended, remembered. The Germans formed up on one side, the English on the other, the officers standing in front, every head bare. Yes, I think it is a sight one will never see again. As the Christmas of 1914 drew to a close, soldiers who had sung together, played together, and prayed together returned to their trenches. They must have felt reluctant to let the common ground between them become again no man's land. But as the darkness fell around them, a lone voice floated across the yards of earth on which they had stood together. In the true spirit of Christmas, one voice, then another, joined in. Soon the whole world seemed to be singing, and for a brief moment the sound of peace was a carol known by every heart and soul. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. And that's the way it was one silent night almost 100 years ago. And that's the way it can be as each of us embrace the message of that silent and holy night. I hope you guys enjoyed the story tonight, and I love you guys so much. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you soon.